Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, what if absolutely everything you thought you knew about chronic illness was completely challenged? Well, today, we're going to objectively dive into two deeply critical perspectives on vaccination. We're going to do this by unpacking a 2020 pediatric study, and then we'll explore some pretty sweeping epidemiological claims made by pharmaceutical industry critic Sasha Latypova. Now, just to be clear up front, our goal here isn't to validate or debunk either side. Instead, we want to clearly map out what these sources are actually arguing using the exact data and theories they present. Let's get into it. So here's our agenda for today. First, we'll look at the vaccine debate sources. Second, the pediatric office visits. Third, driving chronic illness claims. Fourth, mechanisms and historical diseases. And finally, number 5, the pharma liability shield. All right, kicking things off with sections 1 and 2, the vaccine debate sources and the pediatric office visits. We're starting with a 10-year retrospective analysis of a single private pediatric practice. This was authored by James Lyons-Weiler and Paul Thomas. Now, what's really interesting here is the highly variable vaccination uptake among the patients in this specific clinic. If you look on the far left, there is this massive spike of patients who received exactly 0 vaccines. And that's followed by the super wide distribution of patients receiving anywhere from 1 all the way up to 40 vaccines. This variation basically reflects the decisions made between the patient's families and the doctor, which creates this incredibly unique data set of variably vaccinated kids all sharing the exact same clinical environment. So the researchers compared 2 distinct groups from this practice: 561 completely unvaccinated children and 2,763 variably vaccinated children. Now, to make sure the comparison was as fair as possible, comparing apples to apples, they meticulously tracked a metric called days of care to control for healthcare-seeking behavior. This is absolutely crucial because it ensures they aren't just counting kids who happen to visit the doctor more often. They also tracked family history of autoimmunity, noting that 31% of the unvaccinated group had a family history of autoimmune issues, compared to about 25% in the vaccinated group. To actually measure these health outcomes, the study authors used a highly specialized metric called the relative incidence of office visit, or RIOV. It's really important to understand their methodology here. Rather than just asking, hey, did a child get a diagnosis, they actually looked at the total billed office visits that were related to that diagnosis. Basically, this approach attempts to capture not just the mere presence of an illness, but the ongoing day-to-day burden of that illness on the child's life and their healthcare usage. And looking at the findings, even after matching for those days of care we talked about, the authors assert some significantly higher RIOV odds ratios for the vaccinated group across several specific conditions. For example, they reported that the vaccinated cohort was actually over 6 times more likely to have office visits for allergic rhinitis and anemia. And they were about 3.5 times more likely to require visits for asthma compared to the unvaccinated cohort. Now, the authors draw a ton of attention to one specific crucial data point. Exactly 0 of the 561 unvaccinated patients had an ADHD diagnosis. Literally 0. This is compared to a 0.063% rate in the variably vaccinated group. Ultimately, the authors use these localized data points to suggest that the unvaccinated children in this specific practice appear generally healthier than their vaccinated peers. Moving right along to Section 3, Driving Chronic Illness Claims. Let's shift gears to our second source, pharmaceutical industry critic Sasha Latypova. While the previous study looked at just one clinic over 10 years, Latypova is attempting to explain the entire global landscape of modern public health. She argues that vaccines contribute to a truly staggering 98% of the risk for all chronic illnesses across a person's entire lifespan. She presents this as sort of a unifying theory, claiming that whether we're talking about cardiovascular issues, neurodegenerative diseases, or even cancer, injections are the primary overwhelming driver. To put that into perspective, just think about everything else we are constantly told to avoid. Latypova contends that toxic food, the standard American diet, trace glyphosate from pesticides, smoking, environmental radiation. She says all of that combined accounts for a mere 2% of total chronic illness risk. She insists that those lifestyle factors are practically irrelevant compared to the massive impact of vaccine. And she actually extends this claim all the way to day 1, to the vitamin K shot routinely given at birth. Latypova argues that because the shot contains adjuvants like aluminum, which are quite literally designed to provoke an immune response, it's far from benign. She claims that simply receiving this single shot, especially when combined with maternal vaccination, dramatically jumps a newborn's baseline risk of lifelong chronic illness from that baseline of 2% all the way up to 13%. Okay, Section 4. mechanisms and historical diseases. So to explain exactly how these illnesses are allegedly triggered, Latypova goes way beyond just the statistical claims and outlines some very specific biological pathways. First, she claims that injected food proteins, like seed oils or gelatin, actually trick the body into recognizing them as invaders, which induces severe allergic reactions or anaphylaxis. Second, she states that highly positively charged metals like aluminum strip the negative zeta potential from blood cells. And without this negative charge keeping them apart, she says the cells basically clump together, causing microclots. Finally, she argues that newer mRNA platforms are uniquely dangerous because they transfect mammalian cells, essentially entering the cells and fundamentally altering their biological instructions. Now, her theories also drastically revise historical diseases. Latypova boldly asserts that the wild poliovirus never actually existed. According to her narrative, the original virus was allegedly isolated from children who died from botched tonsillectomy surgeries, not from an infectious disease. She claims the polio diagnosis was effectively used as a broad, catch-all cover-up for paralysis that was actually caused by environmental toxins, like pesticides, or surgical malpractice. For instance, she specifically targets the widely accepted historical narrative of former U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. While mainstream history accepts that FDR was paralyzed by polio, Latypova claims he actually suffered from a vaccine-induced case of Guillain-Barré syndrome. She argues that because his paralysis was sudden and bilateral, it aligns much more closely with an adverse injection reaction than with classical infectious polio. Which brings us to Section 5, the Pharma Liability Shield. So this brings us to the systemic implications of these claims. If vaccines cause the massive 98% share of chronic illness alleged by Latypova, it begs an absolutely enormous structural question. How does the pharmaceutical industry avoid crippling legal liability? I mean, why aren't they just sued right into bankruptcy if their products are allegedly this harmful? Well, Latypova argues that they survive because of a succession of legal frameworks that are perfectly designed to shield them. She outlines this whole timeline, beginning with the 1986 National Vaccine Injury Law, which she says provided the very first layer of protection. This then escalated with the 2005 PrEP Act and finally culminated in 2020 with the utilization of emergency powers under Chapter 564 of the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. According to Latypova, this compounding, evolving legal architecture provides manufacturers with a complete and absolute liability shield, just so long as an emergency is declared. Ultimately, Latypova strongly concludes that this dynamic, what is officially termed a public-private partnership, acts as a collaborative shield. In her view, it allows governments to continuously mandate biological products, while entirely protecting the manufacturers from any financial or legal consequences for the harms she alleges they cause. She frames this relationship in the starkest terms possible, comparing it directly to corporatism and fascism. So what does this all mean? Evaluating these specific claims leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder. As we look at the localized data from the pediatric clinic study right alongside Latypova's sweeping epidemiological and legal theories, we have to ask ourselves, does this perspective reveal a deeply hidden truth about public health mandates and chronic illness? Or does it represent a dangerous, fundamental misunderstanding of scientific data and historical medical facts? That is the core tension at the heart of this explainer. Thanks so much for joining me as we unpacked these sources today.